The morning mist clung to the Shenandoah Valley like a funeral shroud, thick and cold enough to make even the hardiest frontiersman pull his coat tighter. It was late October in 1759, and the leaves had turned the color of dried blood, crimson and burnt orange against a sky that promised rain but never delivered. The air smelled of rotting wood and damp earth, the kind of smell that settled deep in your lungs and refused to leave. Atsadi moved through the forest with the silence of a man who had been born to it. He was 32 years old, a Cherokee hunter from the overhill towns near the Little Tennessee River, but the war had pushed him north into Virginia territory. His people called this land the Dark and Bloody Ground, a place where tribal boundaries blurred and violence was as common as breathing. He wore buckskin leggings and a hunting shirt stained with the juice of walnut hulls, his long black hair tied back with a strip of deer hide. His bow, made from Osage orange wood and strung with sinew, hung across his back, and at his belt was a knife with a handle carved from elk antler. He was tracking a white-tailed buck, following the scrapes and rubs the animal had left on the young saplings. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old, and Atsadi could see where the buck had stopped to urinate, marking his territory. It was a mature animal, probably 8 or 9 years old, with antlers that would fetch a good price at the trading post in Staunton. But Atsadi wasn't hunting for trade. He was hunting because his family needed meat for the winter, and because the act of hunting connected him to his ancestors in a way that nothing else could. He never heard the militia patrol until it was too late. There were 11 of them, Virginia frontiersmen, led by a man named Silas Gentry, a fur trader turned Indian killer who wore a necklace made from bear claws and claimed to have taken 20 scalps in his lifetime. They had been drinking corn whiskey since dawn, passing a clay jug between them as they rode through the forest, looking for Cherokee to kill. The war between the British and French had made enemies of everyone, and the Virginia colonists had decided that all Indians were the same, savages to be eliminated before they could strike first. "There's one of the red bastards," Gentry said, pointing at Atsadi through the trees. His voice was thick with liquor and hatred, probably scouting for a war party. Atsadi heard the voice and turned, but he didn't run. Running would have marked him as guilty, and he had done nothing wrong. He raised one hand in a gesture of peace, the universal sign that he meant no harm. But Gentry wasn't interested in peace. The first shot hit Atsadi in the chest, punching through his ribs and collapsing his left lung. He staggered backward, dropping his bow, his hand going to the wound as blood began to soak through his hunting shirt. The pain was enormous, like a burning coal pressed against his sternum, but he didn't cry out. Cherokee warriors were taught from childhood to endure pain without complaint, to face death with dignity. The second shot hit him in the stomach, and this time he fell to his knees. The world tilted sideways, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He looked up at the men on horseback, their faces blurred by the mist and his failing vision, and he understood that he was going to die. Not in battle, not defending his family or his people, but alone in the forest, killed by drunken strangers who would never know his name. "Finish him," Gentry ordered, and one of the younger men, a boy barely old enough to grow a beard, rode forward and fired a third shot into Atsadi's head. The Cherokee hunter fell face first into the leaves, his blood pooling around him like spilled wine. The men dismounted and stood over his body, arguing about whether to take his scalp. Gentry decided against it. "He's just one Indian," he said, spitting tobacco juice onto Atsadi's corpse. "Not worth the trouble. Let the buzzards have him." They took his knife and his bow, stripped the silver armbands from his biceps, and rode away, leaving his body where it fell. In Cherokee tradition, an unburied corpse was a spiritual abomination, a violation so severe that it could trap the soul between worlds, preventing it from crossing to the darkening land where the spirits of the dead resided. But Gentry and his men didn't know that, and they wouldn't have cared if they did. For 3 days, Atsadi's body lay in the forest, exposed to the rain and the scavengers. Crows picked at his eyes, and a red fox gnawed on his fingers. But something strange happened on the fourth morning. A farmer named Jacob Weaver, riding his horse along the edge of the valley, swore he saw a man walking through the fog. A Cherokee man with a hole in his chest, carrying a bow made from Osage orange wood. Weaver rode straight to the nearest settlement, a cluster of cabins near the town of Winchester, and told everyone what he had seen. Most dismissed it as drunken imagination, or the fever dreams of a man who spent too much time alone. But an old woman named Granny Hicks, who had lived on the frontier for 40 years and knew the Cherokee ways, listened carefully and said, "If what you saw is true, then God help us all. Because a returned spirit doesn't walk the earth for no reason. He walks to set things right." That night, the first of Gentry's men disappeared. His name was Thomas Ridley, and he was the youngest of the 11 men who had killed Atsadi. He was 19 years old, with a wife and a baby daughter, and he lived in a small cabin near the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the night of November 3rd, he kissed his wife goodnight, barred the door, and went to sleep with his musket loaded and propped against the wall, a precaution every settler took in those days. He never woke up. When his wife found him the next morning, he was lying in bed with his throat cut from ear to ear, the blood soaked so deeply into the cornhusk mattress that it would never come clean. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his scalp was missing, cut away with a knife so sharp that it had peeled the skin from his skull in one clean piece. And on the floor beside the bed, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 cedar branches, freshly cut and still green. The smell of crushed cedar filled the cabin, a scent so strong it made Thomas's wife vomit. Cedar was sacred to the Cherokee, used in purification rituals and healing ceremonies, but when used in death, it meant something else entirely. It meant that justice was being done. Silas Gentry heard about Ridley's death by noon, and by sunset he had gathered the remaining 10 men at his trading post in Staunton. They were frightened. More frightened than they would ever admit, but Gentry refused to believe that a dead Indian had come back to kill them. "It's one of his kinfolk," he said, pouring whiskey into tin cups and passing them around. "Some Cherokee brave trying to scare us. Well, it won't work. We'll double the guard, keep our weapons close, and if any red-skinned son of a bitch comes near us, we'll blow his head off." But 2 nights later, another man disappeared. His name was Samuel Bright, and he was a blacksmith, with arms like tree trunks and a temper that had gotten him into more than one knife fight. He lived alone in a workshop behind the trading post, and when Gentry found him the next morning, he was hanging from a rafter by his own leather apron, his scalp missing, and his eyes wide open in terror. The smell of cedar was everywhere, so thick it made Gentry's eyes water. This time, there were witnesses. A trapper named Eli Hargrave swore he had seen someone moving through the darkness outside the workshop, a tall figure with long black hair, carrying a bow. When Hargrave called out, the figure turned and looked at him, and Hargrave saw a face he recognized. It was Atsadi, the Cherokee hunter they had killed 3 weeks earlier, except Atsadi had a hole in his chest the size of a fist, and his skin was the color of old ash. "It's him," Hargrave whispered, his voice shaking. "God Almighty, it's him. He's come back." Gentry slapped him hard across the face. "Don't talk like a fool. Dead men don't walk." But the fear was spreading now, moving through the settlement like a disease. Wives refused to let their husbands leave the house after dark. Children woke up screaming from nightmares about a Cherokee hunter with a hole in his chest. And every morning, someone found fresh cedar branches arranged in patterns outside their doors. Circles, crosses, spirals, symbols that no one understood, but everyone feared. On the 6th night, a man named Jacob Sloan was found dead in his cornfield, his body lying face down in the dirt with his scalp missing and a single arrow through his back. The arrow was made from river cane, fletched with turkey feathers, and tipped with a stone point carved in the old style. It was the kind of arrow a Cherokee hunter would have used 100 years ago, before metal came to the mountains. By now, 3 men were dead, and 8 remained. Gentry called a meeting and proposed that they leave Virginia, scatter to different colonies, and wait for the killings to stop. But an older man named Josiah Carr argued against it. "If we run, we're admitting that we're guilty," Carr said. "And besides, how do you know he won't follow us? If what people are saying is true, if this is some kind of spirit, then distance won't save us. The only way to stop him is to find his body and burn it. That's what the Cherokee do with witches. They burn them so they can't come back." Gentry nodded slowly. "Then we find the body and we burn it, and if the son of a bitch shows up while we're doing it, we'll send him back to hell where he belongs." But there was one person in the settlement who didn't believe that burning Atsadi's body would solve anything. Her name was Sarah Mercer, and she was the daughter of a trapper who had traded with the Cherokee for 20 years. She was 24 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes, and she had known Atsadi when she was a child. Her father, William Mercer, had been a fair man who treated the Cherokee with respect, and Atsadi had often visited their cabin to trade venison for gunpowder. Sarah remembered him as quiet and kind, a man who never raised his voice and who carved small wooden animals for her to play with. Once, when she was 10 years old, she had gotten lost in the forest, and Atsadi had found her and carried her home on his shoulders. Her father had offered him payment, but Atsadi had refused, saying that children were sacred and that no payment was needed for saving a life. Now, Sarah stood at the edge of the settlement and watched as Gentry and his men prepared to ride out in search of Atsadi's body. She knew where it was. She had seen the crows circling a few days after the killing, and she had followed them to the place where Atsadi had fallen. She had stood there for a long time, looking down at his ruined corpse, and she had whispered a prayer in Cherokee, one of the few phrases her father had taught her. "Osio, Elisi." "Hello, grandmother." It was a prayer for the dead, a way of asking the ancestors to guide the spirit home. But the spirit hadn't gone home, and now Sarah understood why. She waited until Gentry and his men rode out, and then she saddled her horse and followed them, keeping to the shadows. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. If Atsadi was truly walking the earth again, it wasn't because he was evil. It was because the men who killed him had violated something sacred, something that demanded balance, and balance in the Cherokee way always came with blood. Sarah followed Gentry's party through the forest, staying far enough back that they wouldn't hear her horse. The men rode in a tight group, their muskets loaded, and their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. They looked like soldiers preparing for battle, but Sarah knew they were terrified. She could see it in the way they jumped at every snapping twig, in the way they kept glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting something to rise up out of the ground and drag them down. It took them 2 hours to find the place where Atsadi had been killed. The body was still there, or what was left of it. Scavengers had done their work. His face was gone, his belly torn open, his fingers gnawed down to the bone. But his buckskin leggings were still intact, and the silver armbands Gentry's men had stolen were missing, which meant someone, or something, had come back for them. "Christ," one of the men whispered, turning away to vomit into the bushes. "What kind of animal did that?" "All of them," Gentry said flatly. He dismounted and began gathering branches, piling them around Atsadi's corpse. "Get the fire started. We burn him now, and we burn him hot. I want nothing left but ash." Sarah watched from behind a stand of pine trees, her heart pounding. She wanted to stop them, to tell them that burning Atsadi's body would only make things worse. But she didn't know how to explain what she felt, a deep, bone-level certainty that what they were doing was wrong. She had grown up hearing Cherokee stories, tales her father had told her on winter nights when the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls. One story in particular came back to her now, the story of the Nunahi, the spirit people who lived in the mountains and who could appear and disappear at will. The Cherokee believed that the dead could return if their death had been unjust, if their bodies had been dishonored, if the proper rituals had not been performed. And when they returned, they weren't ghosts in the way white people understood ghosts. They were something else, solid, real, and deadly. Gentry lit the fire with a flint and steel, and the flames caught quickly in the dry wood. Black smoke began to rise, curling up through the trees like a living thing. The men stood in a circle around the pyre, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, and for a moment Sarah thought they looked like demons, gathered around a sacrifice. And then she heard it, a sound that made every hair on her body stand on end. It was a voice, low and rhythmic, chanting in Cherokee. The words were incomprehensible to Sarah, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a death song, the kind of song a warrior sang when he knew he was about to die, a song that called on the spirits to witness his courage and carry his soul to the afterlife. The men heard it too. They spun around, raising their muskets, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, only the forest, dark and silent except for the crackling of the fire. "Who's there?" Gentry shouted, his voice cracking. "Show yourself, you coward!" The chanting stopped, and then from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was Atsadi. He looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, tall and lean, with high cheekbones and eyes like polished obsidian. But there were differences now. Terrible differences. His hunting shirt was soaked with blood, and there was a hole in his chest where the first musket ball had struck him, a wound so deep that Sarah could see the white gleam of bone. His face was expressionless, empty of emotion, but his eyes burned with something that was neither rage nor sorrow. It was something older than both, something that existed before words had been invented to name it. He carried his bow in one hand and an arrow in the other, the same kind of arrow that had been found in Jacob Sloane's back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was message enough. Gentry fired first, the musket blast deafening in the confined space of the clearing. The ball struck Atsadi in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but he didn't fall. He straightened, turned back to face them, and knocked his arrow in one smooth motion. The bowstring sang, and the arrow flew faster than any of the men could track. It hit Josiah Carr in the throat, punching through his windpipe and severing his spine. Carr dropped like a stone, blood fountaining from the wound. Chaos erupted. The men scattered, some running for their horses, others trying to reload their muskets with shaking hands. But Atsadi moved through them like a shadow, his knife flashing in the firelight. He caught one man from behind, grabbed a fistful of his hair, and scalped him with a single stroke, the blade cutting so smoothly that the man didn't even scream until the skin came away from his skull. Another man tried to fight back, swinging a tomahawk at Atsadi's head, but Atsadi ducked under the blow and drove his knife up through the man's ribcage, piercing his heart. Sarah couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her hands gripping the reins of her horse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but all she could do was watch as Atsadi killed them one by one, methodical and unstoppable. He wasn't fighting like a man. He was fighting like something that had already died and had nothing left to fear. Gentry was the last one standing. He had dropped his musket and pulled a pistol from his belt, and now he aimed it at Atsadi's head, his hand trembling. "What are you?" he whispered. "What the hell are you?" Atsadi looked at him with those empty, burning eyes, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time, but the English was clear and precise. "I am what you made me," he said, "a ghost with a debt to collect." He lunged forward, faster than Gentry could pull the trigger, and slammed into him with enough force to knock him off his feet. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the leaves and the blood, and when they stopped, Atsadi was on top of Gentry, his knife pressed against the trader's throat. "Please!" Gentry begged, tears streaming down his face. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "You left me for the crows," Atsadi said quietly. "You took my weapons and my honor, and you left me to rot. In my tradition, that is worse than murder. It is erasure, and erasure demands balance." He drew the knife across Gentry's throat, slow and deliberate, and Gentry's blood poured out onto the forest floor, mixing with the ash from the fire. Atsadi stood, wiped his knife on Gentry's coat, and turned to face Sarah. She should have been terrified. She should have spurred her horse and ridden away as fast as she could. But instead, she dismounted and walked toward him, her legs trembling but her mind clear. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the wound in his chest, close enough to smell the crushed cedar that clung to him like a second skin. "I know you," she said softly. "You saved my life when I was a child." Atsadi studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of a memory. "Sarah Mercer," he said, "William's daughter." "Yes. Your father was a good man. He treated my people with respect. Why are you here?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I came to stop them from burning your body. I thought maybe if I could talk to you, I could help you cross over. My father told me stories about the Nunehai, about spirits who couldn't rest until they found peace. Is that what you are?" Atsadi shook his head slowly. "I am not Nunehai. I am Tsulkalu, one who walks with purpose. My soul cannot cross until the debt is paid. 11 men killed me, 11 scalps I must take. Then, and only then, will I be free." "How many have you taken?" 7. Sarah's stomach twisted. 4 men were still alive, somewhere in the settlements, hiding and waiting for death to find them. She looked at the bodies scattered around the clearing, at the blood and the carnage, and she felt a wave of revulsion so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. But beneath the revulsion was something else, a strange, terrible sense of justice. These men had committed murder. They had violated sacred laws, both Cherokee and human, and now they were paying the price. "What happens after you take the last scalp?" she asked. Atsadi looked past her, toward the dark line of mountains on the horizon. "I will bury myself in the old way. I will sing the death song my grandfather taught me, and I will cross to the darkening land where my ancestors wait. And until then, I hunt." He turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Sarah stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the dead, and for the first time in her life she understood that some wounds could never heal. Some debts could never be forgiven. All that remained was blood and cedar and the cold, indifferent stars. The news of the massacre spread through the settlements like wildfire. By dawn, every cabin and trading post within 50 miles knew that Silas Gentry and 6 of his men had been found dead in the forest, their bodies mutilated and their scalps missing. The survivors, the 4 men who had not been present at the burning, went into hiding, barricading themselves in their homes and refusing to come out even for food or water. Sarah returned to her father's cabin, but she didn't tell him what she had seen. How could she? Who would believe that a dead man had risen from his grave to take revenge on his killers? Who would believe that justice, in its most ancient and brutal form, was walking the earth in the shape of a Cherokee hunter with a hole in his chest? Instead, she sat by the fire and stared into the flames, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. Part of her wanted to warn the remaining men, to tell them to run as far and as fast as they could. But another part of her, a darker, quieter part, believed that Atsadi was right. They had committed an atrocity. They had murdered an innocent man and left his body to rot. And now they were being held accountable, not by colonial law or British justice, but by something older and more absolute. 3 days passed. Sarah heard whispers from the other settlers. Stories about strange lights moving through the forest at night, about the smell of cedar that appeared without explanation, about a figure that walked along the ridgelines at dawn, carrying a bow and singing songs in a language that no living person understood. The 4 surviving men, Peter Crane, Daniel Moss, Isaac Braddock, and Henry Turnbull, refused to leave their homes, convinced that if they stayed inside, the spirit couldn't reach them. They were wrong. Peter Crane was the first to die. He lived in a fortified cabin with walls made from squared logs and gun ports cut into the shutters. He had enough food and ammunition to last a month, and he swore he would shoot anything that came within 100 yards of his door. But on the night of November 10th, he woke to the sound of scratching on his roof, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging across wood. He grabbed his musket and aimed it at the ceiling, shouting for whoever was up there to show themselves. The scratching stopped, and then the roof collapsed. Atsadi dropped through the hole like a stone, landing in a crouch in the middle of Crane's cabin. Crane fired, but the shot went wide, punching a hole through the wall and missing Atsadi by inches. Before Crane could reload, Atsadi was on him, the knife flashing in the dim light of the hearth. When they found Crane's body the next morning, he was lying on the floor with his scalp missing and 7 cedar branches arranged in a circle around his head. Daniel Moss was next. He had locked himself in the cellar of his cabin, convinced that underground was the safest place to hide. But Atsadi found him anyway, prying open the cellar door with a crowbar and descending into the darkness. Moss tried to fight back with a pitchfork, but Atsadi disarmed him with a single blow, snapping the wooden handle in half and driving the broken end into Moss's stomach. He took Moss's scalp and left the body where it lay, the smell of cedar so strong that it lingered for days afterward. Isaac Braddock and Henry Turnbull made a pact. They would stay together, back to back, armed and ready, until the spirit either gave up or was destroyed. They barricaded themselves in the trading post, boarding up the windows and stacking furniture against the doors. For 2 days they sat in the darkness, listening to every creak and groan of the building, their fingers white-knuckled on the triggers of their muskets. On the 3rd night, Atsadi came for them. He didn't break down the door or smash through the windows. He simply appeared inside the trading post, as if he had walked through the walls. Braddock saw him first and fired, the musket ball passing through Atsadi's torso without slowing him down. Turnbull fired next, hitting Atsadi in the leg, but Atsadi didn't fall. He moved toward them with the slow, inexorable patience of death itself, and when he reached them, he killed them both with his knife, one after the other, taking their scalps and laying their bodies side by side. 11 men, 11 scalps. The debt was paid. Sarah heard about the last 2 deaths from a trapper who came to her father's cabin looking for supplies. She felt no surprise, only a strange, hollow sadness. She knew what came next. Atsadi had completed his task. Now he would bury himself and cross over to the darkening land, and the terror that had gripped the settlements would finally end. But she needed to see it for herself. She needed to know that it was truly over. She rode out at dawn, following the trails she had learned as a child, and she found Atsadi in a clearing high up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He had dug a shallow grave at the base of an old oak tree, and he was kneeling beside it, his hands covered in dirt. The 11 scalps hung from his belt, swaying gently in the wind. He looked up when he heard her approach, but he didn't seem surprised. "You came to watch me die," he said. Sarah dismounted and walked toward him, her heart aching. "I came to say goodbye." Atsadi nodded slowly. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a wooden carving, a rabbit no larger than Sarah's thumb, with delicate ears and tiny paws. She recognized it immediately. It was one of the animals he had carved for her when she was a child, one of the many gifts he had given her during his visits to her father's cabin. "I made this for you 20 years ago," he said. "I carried it with me when I died. I don't know why. Perhaps I knew that someday I would see you again." He placed the carving in her hand, closing her fingers around it. His skin was cold, colder than the November air, and Sarah realized with a jolt that he wasn't breathing. He hadn't been breathing since the moment he died. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "For everything." Atsadi stood and looked out over the mountains toward the place where the sun was beginning to rise. The light was golden and soft, filtering through the trees and painting the world in shades of amber and honey. He began to sing, a low, mournful chant that Sarah didn't understand but felt in her bones. It was a song of farewell, a song that thanked the earth and the sky and the spirits for allowing him to complete his task. When the song ended, he lay down in the grave and pulled the dirt over himself, covering his body with slow, deliberate movements. Sarah wanted to help him, but she knew this was something he had to do alone. She stood and watched as the earth swallowed him, inch by inch, until only his face was visible. He looked up at her one last time, and his eyes, those empty, burning eyes, softened into something almost human. "Tell your children about me," he said. "Tell them that justice is not a thing written in books or spoken in courthouses. It is a thing carved into the bones of the world. And when it is violated, the world will always find a way to set it right." He closed his eyes, and the last of the dirt fell over his face. Sarah stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the weight of the wooden rabbit in her hand. She thought about the 11 men who had died, about the fear and the violence and the blood. She thought about the settlers who would tell this story for generations, who would whisper about the Cherokee hunter who returned from death to take his revenge. But she also thought about balance and about the terrible necessary cost of justice. She thought about how some wounds could only be healed with blood, how some debts could only be paid with death. And she understood finally that Atsadi had not been a monster or a curse. He had been a man who refused to let his murder go unanswered, a spirit who walked the earth to reclaim what had been stolen from him. As she rode back down the mountain, the sun fully risen now and the forest alive with birdsong, Sarah whispered a prayer in Cherokee, the same prayer she had spoken over Atsadi's body weeks ago. "Osio, Elisi. Hello, grandmother. Guide him home." And somewhere, deep in the darkening land, the ancestors heard her and welcomed their son back into the circle of the dead. The cedar smoke faded, the terror ended, and Atsadi, the Cherokee hunter who had returned after death, finally found peace. But in the settlements, the story never died. Mothers told it to their children, and those children told it to theirs. A reminder that in a land soaked in blood and betrayal, justice sometimes wore the face of a ghost. And if you walked through the Shenandoah Valley on a foggy morning, if you listened carefully to the wind moving through the trees, you might still hear the faint echo of a death song, a warrior's farewell, sung by a man who refused to be forgotten.